In making this film, I stood on the shoulders of giants. That's Peter and Bethany. They had spent 2 years on this story, and Bethany was actually part of the story originally. She was one of the first people to think that Enron might be a kind of a fraud, or there might be something wrong with Enron. My first step was to wonder if I should have my head examined for doing a film about accounting.
I think people from the outside think it's important. Tells me something about corporate America and perhaps about the world that I really should understand, but I don't want to understand this. It's about numbers, it's about complicated transactions, it's all these amazingly intricate financial dealings.
I wasn't particularly interested in the Enron story as a film. I knew about it, a little bit about it, from what anybody would read in the newspaper.
This is a case of America's largest corporate bankruptcy.
Until my sister-in-law, who works at Fortune, gave me a copy of the book, The Smartest Guys in the Room. That book floored me because it was so rich in terms of the characters.
When he read our book, he saw that it was actually a story about people, and not even a story about people that's just a business story, but really a story that to me is a human tragedy. It's kind of people on a grand scale.
That was the aspect of the story that really got me, this whole idea of these all-American characters who are not to the manner born, inventing themselves and a company out of whole cloth.
During my years at Fortune, I tended to write really heavy-duty accounting stories, more out of a desperate desire to get published than out of a natural inclination towards such things. This was kind of the era when everybody wanted to write big, glossy profiles of CEOs. I had not expected Enron's reaction to be that extreme. I was not accusing the company of fraud. I was saying the stock price something doesn't seem to add up here. The numbers don't make sense given where the stock was trading at astronomical levels, and the numbers don't seem to justify this kind of stock price. So I didn't expect them to like the story, but I didn't expect them to respond the way they did.
In March 2001, Bethany McLean, a reporter with Fortune magazine, first raised questions about Enron's financial condition. She asked a simple question in the article that no one could seem to answer. How exactly does Enron make its money?
In the congressional hearing, Jeff Skilling notes, as they're talking about Bethany, that he sent up his team to explain to Bethany the questions that she was asking.
To sit down with the reporter on that story and help her understand the questions that she was asking.
Not to give her the answers, but she obviously, wasn't smart enough to even understand the questions she was asking, and they were going to go educate her. Well, it turned out that it backfired, that Bethany knew a lot more than they thought she knew, and that the firepower of the people they sent up, which included Andy Fastow, was no match for Bethany. The key people that we focused on were the unholy trinity of Ken Lay, Jeff Skilling, and Andy Fastow. Ken Lay was the man at the top and the kind of political figure. He liked that game very much, being the ambassador of Enron all over the world. Jeff Skilling was the doer. He's a very interesting character because he's a man of ideas. He believes the idea is everything. But he's also an interestingly American character in the sense that he literally reinvents himself. And then Andy Fastow is kind of the enabler, the sorcerer's apprentice. Now, there's a lot of differences of opinion about who knew what about what Andy Fastow was doing. I believe that there was a certain amount of deniability. Both Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling needed Andy Fastow because he, in effect, propped up Enron for a couple of years where it might have gone bankrupt long before. But other people believe, notably Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling, that Andy Fastow was a rogue agent operating inside Enron, just doing horrible things that they didn't know anything about, and they were shocked, like Claude Rains was shocked in Casablanca to find that gambling was going on in this casino.
I have a certain level of sympathy for Jeff Skilling. I think that he was devastated by Enron's collapse. I think on some level he knew Enron was fragile. I think on another level he desperately needed to believe in the success of this company. And I think his life has been destroyed by Enron's collapse, whether or not he goes to jail. I despise Ken Lay a lot more for his just ability to kind of walk away.
Linda and I saw our net worth reduced from several $100 million down to something less than $20 million on a net worth basis.
To me, Ken Lay kind of floated above it and was willing to accept the hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation.
Enormous trust.
Ken Lay has a lot to answer, ethically. I don't mean that he has a lot to answer for criminally. Criminal guilt and ethical guilt are two different things.
I didn't read the original article until I read the book. I had a very strong basis in terms of the content, but I had to make a film out of it, which meant that I had to approach people who could express themselves well on camera, and also, in a way, I had to find my own way into the story. My biggest challenge really was the fact that everybody was in some kind of legal proceeding, either criminal or civil. So we had a very hard time getting people to talk to us and to find materials. I was lucky to find materials that they didn't have in the book. The most incredible thing we found, thanks to a small utility company in Washington State, were the audio tapes of the Enron traders taking down the California grid.
And we're the future of Enron, and we're fucking making $500 million for Enron. Can you believe that? We'll definitely retire by we're 30.
If you had written this in a movie script, the kind of stuff that these guys said, it would have been unbelievable. So this is an inside look into a kind of capitalism that people, sort of conspiracy theorists talk about.
What's happening?
There's a fire under the core line. It's been derated from 45 to 2100.
Burn, baby, burn.
Hearing these guys, and they were mostly guys, talking like it was some kind of Saturday night frat prank, even as they were bringing down the grid of the 7th largest economy in the world. That was staggering. Traders do behave in ways that are predatory. It's part of the culture, and you hear a lot of swearing on the trading floor, and you hear a lot of sort of macho posturing. It's like, you gotta act like a shark or you're gonna be eaten. And that part I understood. But what was remarkable about this was that their target was really the people of California. That's what was staggering. So they completely lost touch with any kind of ethical code. It had become a game to them. It was like a video game they were playing, and yet the consequences were that the lights were going off all over the state. That was just staggering to me to hear them, and it was more the tone of their voice. They were just chuckling, they were laughing the whole time.
Now she wants her fucking money back for all the power you jammed right up her ass for fucking 200.
You hear that from traders, but in this case, they had completely lost any sense of perspective. I think that at Enron, the top executives created a culture. It was a purposefully combative, predatory culture.
You'll now get a shock of 75 volts.
When we use a clip from the Milgram experiment, that famous psychological experiment, it's an experiment about obedience. At Enron, the idea was you were training warriors. So these warriors would kill each other in combat inside the company, and then the ones that survived would be steeled warriors who'd go out and fight in the marketplace. At Enron, the traders were not on the lowest level of the company. In fact, by the end, they ran the place. One of the interesting things about the film from a formal perspective was trying to find a visual look that suited the subject. We worked very hard to put these reflective surfaces that would act as a kind of emotional reminder of this kind of double-edged quality of Enron. What was the real McCoy and what was the reflection, or sometimes the shadow? That idea of surface and reflection was very powerful in Enron, and we tried to come up with a visual style that would pick that up. The idea of a film, I think, is to present certain factual data, or the idea of a documentary, but also to create a kind of emotional sense. When you see that footage of the skydiver plummeting toward Earth, there's a kind of playful quality in which you understand what it's like for a company to go into that kind of free fall, and what it must have been like for these executives in the middle of the night to realize, oh my God, the stock is going straight down, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. There was a lot of controversy about the recreation of Cliff Baxter's suicide at the beginning of the film, and that was something we argued about a lot in the cutting room, whether it was appropriate or right to include it. I felt it was very important that, in effect, you'd be riding on the leather of that seat to have some emotional sense of what it must be like for someone. At that point, it's someone, it's anyone, we don't know him yet, that someone would take his life. And we'll never know why anybody commits suicide, but that kind of dramatic action gives some sense of the gravity of what happened at Enron.
There was a difference of opinion on the rules of the independent system operator.
In many ways, I think Enron is a black comedy. It's like the Billie Holiday song. It's a beautiful melody with a haunting undercurrent. I think black comedy is laughs with an undercurrent of moral outrage. But there was something deeply funny about a lot of the stuff that happened at Enron.
There was a guy named Lou Pye.
In the skits, for example, like that skit where they're joking about mark-to-market accounting.
We did $20 million last year.
It's just hilariously funny.
$120 million this year.
Oh, Jeff!
At some point, we interjected material that we felt put some of that into perspective. And so, you know, I give a lot of credit for that to my editor, Allison Elwood, who began to play with a lot of this extreme sports footage, kind of riffing off of the motocross trips that these executives were taking. And if you think about it, that's pretty funny too. Here you have these paunchy, bald guys in glasses who are suddenly, you know, becoming He-Man. It's like, you know, Revenge of the Nerds. Enron, as you can imagine, was a grist for the political cartoonist. There are a lot of political cartoons that have been made about Enron. One of my favorites is Fear Factor, I think it's called, where Ken Lay is about to be dropped into a cage full of angry Enron stockholders. I think that Jeff Skilling and Ken Lay don't exhibit any shame, and in fact, I think they now feel as if they are victims, which is, I think, bitterly ironic. A lot of people at Enron felt very guilty. I talked to a lot of them who felt very disturbed about what had happened, and they felt they had got caught up in something.
It was such a surprise to me that 99% of the people who worked at Enron, even the people who were in a position to see it, didn't see it because they didn't want to add it up. And I think that tells such a large story of human nature and the process by which we rationalize and deceive ourselves when doing so is in our best interest.
I think the story of Enron exposes the major flaw in capitalism, which is the crude belief that raw self-interest left untethered will always result in the best possible social good. It's not so.
From 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., we're paying for bandwidth that we are not using.
Why?
And I think if there's a broad message to the Enron film, it's we should all ask why. What Bethany did as a reporter was to ask why, to ask some very simple questions and to demand some answers that could be understood. And what Enron was great at was bluffing people intellectually and saying, oh, if you don't understand it, then, you know, don't ask me to explain it to you. And a lot of people would back off because they were very insecure. The fact is, we'd all be better off if, in a democracy, if we asked those basic questions, if we asked why.